She was denied first class for being black 10 minutes later. The plane would never be the same. Narration style, emotional hook. What would you do if someone took your seat just because of your skin color? What if the flight crew let it happen and everyone around stayed silent? She was a respected CEO. Her name was Sienna Jameson. She had earned every mile, every title, every right to sit in seat 1A. But that day, at the boarding gate, they looked past her power and only saw her color. Why did the flight attendant ignore her boarding pass? Who was the white woman that took her seat and smirked like she belonged more? And what made the entire plane turn silent? Until one flight attendant whispered 3 words that changed everything. This isn't just a story about an airline. It's about dignity, silence, power, and what happens when someone refuses to move. Stay with us, because what unfolds mid-air will shake you to your core, and what happens after might just restore your faith. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel if you believe that respect has no altitude limit. Now, let's begin the story. The terminal buzzed softly with morning motion. Announcements echoed overhead, footsteps tapped across polished tile floors, and the scent of brewed espresso wafted from a nearby cafe. At Gate 47 of JFK International Airport, AeroVantage Airlines prepared Flight AV602 for departure to Los Angeles. Among the sea of travelers, a woman moved with calm precision. Sienna Jameson walked with quiet strength, wearing a crisp navy blazer over a simple cream blouse, dark denim tailored to perfection, and low-heeled leather boots. Her carry-on was sleek, her leather portfolio neatly tucked beneath her arm. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She didn't have to. She was flying first class for a reason, as the boarding gate agent called for Group 1 passengers. Sienna rose from the lounge bench, checked her phone one last time for messages from her assistant Maya, and walked forward. At the podium, a smiling attendant scanned her pass without hesitation. "Thank you, Ms. Jameson. Enjoy your flight." Sienna gave a soft smile and made her way down the jet bridge. But at the aircraft door, where warm greetings and subtle glances often met first-class passengers, the mood shifted. Standing at the entrance was Melissa Kramer. Melissa had the look of someone who had perfected efficiency into elegance. Her golden hair was tucked neatly into a tight bun. Her smile was poised but selective. She wore the Navy AeroVantage uniform like a badge of rank rather than service. Her eyes flicked over Sienna quickly. Down, then up, then paused. "May I see your boarding pass again?" "Ma'am?" she asked, her voice crisp but cooled by suspicion. Sienna blinked. Not surprised, just tired. She handed it over again, silently. Melissa scanned it, glanced at the seat number, then back at Sienna. "First class," she murmured under her breath, but not low enough. Another passenger behind Sienna shifted uncomfortably. Melissa tilted her head. "Are you sure this was booked in your name?" Sienna's voice remained soft. "Yes, I booked it myself." "Is there a problem?" Melissa hesitated for just a beat too long. "One moment, please. I just need to check something with the purser." Without waiting for a response, she disappeared into the first-class galley. Passengers behind Sienna fidgeted. One woman craned her neck to see what was going on. A man, 2 spots behind, sighed loudly, but Sienna didn't move. She knew this dance. It had no music, only the familiar rhythm of doubt. As she waited, her mind drifted uninvited but persistent back to a different door. 15 years ago. Her first job interview, same questions. Are you sure you're in the right room? Can I help you find the admin desk? Different setting, same assumptions. Melissa returned after 2 minutes that felt like 10. Okay, she said, not apologizing, not smiling. You can proceed. Sienna walked forward, her calm unshaken, but inside her chest something flickered. Not quite anger, not quite sadness, something quieter, wearier. She found her seat 2A by the window. The white headrest cover bore the AeroVantage logo embroidered in silver. She settled in smoothly, placing her portfolio under the seat and her carry-on above. She reached for the leather strap of her bag and adjusted it. Slow, precise. She could feel it, even without looking Melissa's eyes still on her. The man next to her glanced up briefly from his Wall Street Journal. Russell Blaine, mid-60s, salt and pepper hair, expensive watch, attitude of inherited comfort. He gave Sienna a quick look, then returned to his paper, shifting slightly as if to define invisible boundaries. Sienna exhaled and looked out the window, watching the other passengers file in. Her seat felt colder than she expected. 10 minutes passed. Then Melissa returned. She leaned slightly toward Sienna's row and said, "Ma'am, I need to reconfirm your seat assignment. There's been some system irregularity." Sienna turned her head slowly. Her voice remained even. "I was already cleared by the gate agent, and you just verified it again. Remember," Melissa smiled tightly, "it's just a formality. Protocol. Please stay seated while I double-check with the cabin crew." She walked away again. Russell lowered his newspaper. He didn't say anything, but his brow furrowed slightly, like he was unsure whether to be bothered or amused. Sienna didn't look at him. She reached into her portfolio and pulled out her ID. CEO, Avo Renew Global. Her name in bold, embossed font. She stared at it for a moment, then returned it inside. She wasn't angry. Not yet. She was calculating. Would raising her voice help? No. Would standing up escalate things? Possibly. Would remaining calm cost her? Probably, but it was the only currency she'd been allowed to carry for years. Melissa returned once more. Her tone had cooled. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we may need to reseat you temporarily while we sort this out." Temporarily, Sienna asked. "Yes, there's an open seat in premium economy." The words dropped like ice water. No apology, no explanation, just a relocation. Sienna inhaled slowly. "I booked first class. I paid for first class. And unless there's a mechanical issue with the seat itself, I'm not moving." Melissa's lips tightened. Behind her, another flight attendant entered the cabin, a woman with warm eyes and dark hair pulled back neatly. Her badge read Diana Myers, cabin supervisor. She paused, observing the tension in the row. Sienna met her gaze, and for the first time since stepping onto the plane, felt the faintest trace of human recognition. It was going to be a long flight, but something inside her had already decided. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. Sienna sat still in seat 2A, her body calm but her mind in motion. The cabin was filling now. Coats rustling, overhead bins slamming shut. But the space around her felt suspended in a quiet tension. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that scratches beneath the surface of civility. Diana Myers, the cabin supervisor, stood quietly a few rows away. She hadn't moved since their brief glance. Her eyes lingered for just long enough to register something more than curiosity. Something like concern. Sienna appreciated that. Silent concern was better than silent compliance. She adjusted the silver ring on her finger, a gift from her late grandmother, and glanced at her watch. 10 minutes until scheduled departure. 10 minutes was an eternity in this kind of tension. Melissa had vanished again, likely to confirm whatever manufactured irregularity she'd clung to. Sienna's gut told her this wasn't about seating protocol. This was about something older, something deeper, the kind of disbelief that lives in plain sight and wears professionalism as a shield. She closed her eyes for a moment and reminded herself of her own gravity. She wasn't new to this. She had led negotiations with world governments, sat across from oil barons who called her young lady with a smile full of teeth. She'd been underestimated so often, it no longer stung. But here, in this small space of stitched leather and stale air, it still settled under her skin. A small bump in the cart aisle broke her reflection. "Excuse me," a soft voice said. Sienna opened her eyes. It was a young woman, early 20s, maybe wearing an Aero Vantage uniform, though clearly newer. Her badge read Ava Chen. She was pushing a pre-departure refreshment cart and hesitated as she reached row 2. "Would you like a water or juice?" Ma'am Sienna's expression softened. "Water, please. Thank you." Ava handed her a chilled glass and, just for a second, leaned in slightly. "I saw what happened," she whispered. "You don't deserve that." Sienna met her eyes. There was nothing dramatic in her tone, no performative outrage, just a quiet offering of truth. That small moment, that simple sentence, meant more than most people would realize. "Thank you," Sienna said gently. Ava nodded once and rolled on. Meanwhile, Russell, her seatmate, looked up from his tablet. "Well, that was awkward," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "These airlines really don't know how to handle upgrades anymore." Sienna turned her head slowly. "This wasn't an upgrade," she said evenly. "I purchased this seat weeks ago." Russell raised his eyebrows. "Oh, well, then that's even stranger. He didn't say sorry. He didn't ask questions. He just returned to his screen, mildly uncomfortable now that neutrality didn't shield him." Sienna turned back to the window. She thought about Maya again. Her assistant had offered to handle the booking weeks ago, but Sienna insisted on doing it herself. She preferred details, control, precision. It was a habit formed from years of navigating rooms that demanded she always have her receipts ready. Her phone buzzed in her lap, a message from Maya. "Let me know when you're in the air, and breathe, you're not alone." Sienna smiled faintly. Maya always knew when to check in. Her loyalty wasn't just professional, it was protective, grounding. She typed back, still on the ground. "Drama unfolding. We'll explain later," then added, "Thank you." Before she could pocket the phone, Diana finally approached. "Ms. Jameson," she said softly, "I'd like to apologize for the delay and the confusion. We've confirmed your booking is fully in order. You are absolutely entitled to this seat. There will be no changes." Sienna met her gaze. "Thank you, Ms. Myers." Diana hesitated, then added, "If you need anything during the flight, please don't hesitate to speak directly with me." It wasn't an overcompensation. It wasn't performative. It was professional accountability spoken with sincere tone. Sienna nodded. Behind them, Melissa reappeared. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes darted to Diana before settling back on Sienna. "No issues," Diana told her simply. Melissa said nothing. She turned sharply and walked toward the rear galley. The unspoken was louder than the spoken. The pilot's voice crackled overhead. Routine departure announcements. Weather in L.A. was clear. Estimated arrival time 4 hours and 55 minutes. Fasten seatbelts. Put away devices. Prepare for takeoff. As the aircraft pulled back from the gate and engines roared to life, Sienna pressed her head gently against the seat back and exhaled slowly. Her eyes closed again. She welcomed the lift, but her mind wouldn't let her rest. This wasn't over, not because she wanted retribution, not because she needed to prove anything, but because these moments, this dance of disbelief, this ritual of subtle dislocation, they happened every day. Quietly, systemically, and most people never even saw them. She thought about the boardroom last fall, the investor who asked if her co-founder would be joining her, assuming no woman could have scaled a clean tech company to unicorn status alone. She thought about the security guard last month who trailed her through the lobby of her own headquarters. She thought about the high school career counselor who once told her to look into hospitality rather than aerospace engineering. More suited to your personality, he'd said. This wasn't about a seat. This was about belonging, about being told again and again that you don't look like what power is supposed to look like. Sienna opened her eyes and stared at the seat back in front of her. She wasn't angry. She was clear. Clarity was harder to shake than fury. As the plane climbed, the sun caught the edge of the clouds, scattering warm light across the cabin. Sienna reached into her bag and pulled out her journal. She opened to a fresh page and began to write. Not for the world, not for the media. For herself, date, flight number, gate, incident, details, faces, tone, language used. She documented everything, not to complain, to build record, to remember, to reflect. If it ever came to light, she would not speak without precision. Across the aisle, a young boy watched her curiously. His mother leaned in and said something about manners. Sienna gave him a small wave. He waved back shyly. Somewhere near the back, Melissa was likely recalibrating her demeanor, but even if she didn't say another word, the damage had been done. Sometimes the most dangerous thing about discrimination is not its volume, it's its subtlety. The polite tone, the plausible deniability, the just following protocol mask, and that's what made it so hard to confront, so easy to dismiss, so deeply rooted. Sienna clicked her pen closed and looked out the window. Below her, the world was shrinking, but inside, something larger was forming. By the time the aircraft reached cruising altitude, the cabin had quieted into the soft hush of collective isolation. Passengers settled in, screens flickered to life, and the hum of the engines offered a strangely meditative rhythm. But in seat 2A, Sienna Jameson's thoughts were anything but quiet. She stared out the window again. Though she saw little of the clouds, her reflection was more vivid than the horizon. Strong cheekbones, deep brown eyes, and the kind of stillness that masked the burn of thought beneath it all. The silence in her seat belied the roar of contradiction inside her. She had not responded, not in the terminal, not when Melissa had spoken to her like she was out of place, not even when the man beside her tried to make her discomfort a policy glitch. The old voice inside her had whispered its familiar warnings. Don't give them a reason. Stay composed. You know how fast they turn a black woman's defense into aggression, into threat, into removal. But now, at 36,000 feet, she questioned that silence. What would have happened if she had spoken louder? What would it have cost her? Dignity was a strange currency. Sometimes silence was the most expensive thing a person could afford. Sienna reached for her journal again, but before she could open it, Diana returned to the cabin with a subtle urgency in her steps. She stopped just past row 1, leaned in to whisper something into Melissa's ear. Melissa's face stiffened. She looked toward Sienna for half a second, then quickly away. Sienna didn't need to hear it to feel it. Whatever had happened, whatever Diana had said, wasn't routine. The man across the aisle, an older gentleman in a gray sweater with airline miles practically woven into his skin, raised an eyebrow. He, too, noticed the quiet choreography unfolding. Melissa didn't protest, but she didn't apologize either. She simply walked toward the back of the aircraft with a measured grace that tried to outpace the tension in her shadow. The remaining attendants resumed service as if nothing had occurred, but something in the energy shifted. Russell finally looked up from his screen again. "Was that about earlier?" he asked. Sienna didn't respond right away. "It was," she said softly. He nodded, a bit embarrassed. "I guess. I didn't realize it was that serious." She turned her head slowly toward him. Her voice was calm but edged with quiet steel. "Because for you, it never is." He flinched not from anger but from a clarity he hadn't been prepared for. He looked away, into the aisle, then back at her. "I'm sorry," he said. "Really?" Sienna gave a small nod, not because it made anything right, but because acknowledgement, even clumsy, was a beginning. A few minutes later, Diana returned. Her tone was quiet but official. "Ms. Jameson," she said, "we've informed the captain of the incident. Melissa has been relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. A formal report will follow once we land. I wanted you to know that we take this seriously." Sienna looked at her, eyes searching. "Thank you for saying that." Diana hesitated, then added, "It shouldn't have happened. Not in 2025, not on my watch." There was something personal in her voice, not scripted, not rehearsed, just real. Sienna nodded again, this time slower. The flight continued without further disruption, but inside, the layers began to peel. Sienna opened her journal again. This time, she didn't just document, she began to write her thoughts about silence, about the power dynamics that still operated 30,000 feet above ground, where class and race collided in quiet rituals of exclusion. She remembered the first time it happened. She was 24, on her first business trip, wearing a borrowed blazer 2 sizes too big. She had stepped up to the priority boarding lane with her printed ticket and was told, without looking, "This line is for first class only." She hadn't said anything then, either. She had stepped aside, let the man behind her pass. Then she walked back to the desk and showed the same agent her ticket again. Only then did the smile come, forced and plastic. "Oh, sorry about that." She had carried that moment for years, like a stone in her pocket, just heavy enough to remind her it was still there. And now, here it was again, dressed in new fabric, but no less familiar. As the cabin lights dimmed and dinner trays were distributed, Sienna barely touched her food. Her appetite had surrendered hours ago. She sipped her water and looked around. Across from her, the old man in the gray sweater gave her a small nod of respect. He didn't say anything, but he saw her. It was enough, behind her. Ava passed by again, collecting trays. Their eyes met. Ava's glance carried something more than sympathy now. Admiration. Strength recognizes strength. And somewhere, deep inside Sienna, a quiet resolve began to form. She wasn't just going to document this, she was going to speak on it. not for retribution, but for recalibration. She would write about it, not for clickbait or outrage or lawsuit, but to name it, to carve it into record, because silence was no longer sustainable. There were too many women who had sat in too many seats, questioned for their place, made to feel like errors in systems designed to exclude them. She thought about her nieces, about the girls in her mentorship program, about the college student who sent her a letter last week saying, "I didn't think CEOs could look like me until I saw you speak at Howard." This wasn't just about a seat. It was about a ceiling disguised as a gate, and she wasn't going to let it stand unchallenged anymore. As she began to draft her statement, words flowed without hesitation. She didn't name names, not yet. She described the flight, the moment, the experience, the tone. She described the silence that had once felt like safety, but now felt like surrender. And she ended it with a line that had been circling her mind since wheels left the ground. Elevation is not just about altitude, it is about awareness. She closed her notebook and let the sentence linger in her chest. Ahead, the sky was clear. But Sienna Jameson had never flown only to see the clouds. She flew to change the air for those still grounded. The meal trays had been cleared, the cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow, casting a golden hush over the aisles. Most passengers had slipped into the quiet rhythm of a long-haul flight, lulled by earbuds, cabin pressure, and the subtle rocking of the aircraft. But in row 12 something was different. There, a man sat rigidly upright in the seat 12C, his fingers pressed together like he was praying, but his eyes wide open. He had watched the incident earlier with the sharp perception of someone used to being overlooked and underestimated. His name was Elijah Dorsey, a public defense attorney out of Chicago. His afro was clipped tight, and his suit jacket folded carefully on his lap like he didn't trust the airline with the overhead bin. He wasn't rich, he wasn't famous, but he recognized injustice like a heartbeat. Elijah had boarded late, thanks to a delay on his connecting flight from Memphis. He hadn't seen the confrontation unfold in real time, but he had heard the whispering. And later, when the announcement came that one of the crew had been relieved of duty mid-flight, his curiosity took shape. He leaned forward in his seat now, eyes drawn to the front of the cabin, where seat 2A remained upright, calm, but never invisible to him. That woman. He recognized her, not by name, but by presence. He had once seen her speak at a conference in Atlanta. She'd been bold but careful, strong yet precise. He remembered how she talked about systemic barriers with the quiet force of someone who had climbed over each one and carried the scars to prove it. Sienna Jameson. Now, here she was again, not at a podium, not commanding a stage, but seated in silence, enduring the kind of casual cruelty the world reserved for people like them in spaces they were never expected to occupy. He couldn't stop thinking about it, about how she said nothing, yet everything had changed, and it made something rise in him, uninvited but long overdue, an ache, not for confrontation, but for recognition. He reached down and opened the worn leather messenger bag tucked beneath the seat. Out came a manila folder, thick with affidavits and legal motions. He wasn't on this flight for leisure. He was headed to San Francisco to defend a woman charged with resisting arrest. The video, of course, told a different story. She hadn't resisted. She had wept, begged, collapsed. Elijah had taken the case pro bono, because sometimes justice doesn't pay well, but it still pays forward. Now, he opened a notebook, scribbled a few lines, then closed it again. The man in 12D beside him, a tech investor named Martin, glanced over. "You saw all that earlier, didn't you?" he asked. Elijah didn't look up. "I did." "You think it was overblown?" This time Elijah did look at him. His tone was level. Martin hesitated. "I mean, firing someone midair feels a little extreme." Elijah kept his voice calm. "What's extreme is how often people like her get treated like that with no consequence. What's extreme is the silence that usually follows." Martin shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't mean it that way. I know." Elijah turned back toward the front of the plane, and Martin didn't say anything else. Meanwhile, in 2A, Sienna glanced down at her tablet. A draft of her public statement was nearly complete. She had written every word with precision, removing names but not truth. She wasn't trying to go viral. She wasn't looking to shame. She wanted something far more difficult. She wanted understanding. Across the aisle, Russell tapped her arm gently. "I read what you posted," he said. Sienna raised an eyebrow. "Already it's spreading fast. Someone in 4D must have seen you writing. I just saw it shared on LinkedIn. Your words are hitting." She sighed softly, her fingers resting on the armrest. "I didn't post anything yet." Russell blinked. "Wait, you didn't?" "No, not yet." "Then someone else?" He trailed off. Sienna turned toward him, a calm curiosity behind her eyes. "Did they quote it directly?" He pulled out his phone and showed her. It was a paraphrased version, written by Ava Chen, the young flight attendant. She hadn't said who the woman was, only described a black professional being denied boarding, then quietly reclaiming her place and her dignity. Her post ended with, "I watched Grace hold its breath. Then I watched it breathe." There were already thousands of shares. Sienna exhaled. For a moment, she didn't know whether to feel seen or exposed, but then something inside her softened. Ava hadn't violated her. She had honored her. And now, the truth was no longer confined to a single cabin. Farther back, Elijah scrolled through his feed and saw the same post. He smiled, faint but firm. A ripple had begun. Not rage, not chaos, but conscience. He pulled up his notes again, began writing something of his own. Back at the front, Diana returned with a message for Sienna. "The captain has received an in-flight communication. The airline's Board of Ethics would like to speak with you upon landing, privately." Sienna nodded. "All right. They also want to extend a formal apology. On record." Sienna looked down for a long time, and when she looked back up, she asked gently, "What about Melissa?" Diana hesitated. "She's been placed on immediate administrative leave. I believe there will be a review." "And the others?" Sienna asked. "You mean the staff who saw and said nothing, yes." Diana bit her lip. "We're not always trained for moments like this, but that's not an excuse. We should be. We have to be." Sienna nodded once, then twice. "Thank you for your honesty." It wasn't a resolution, but it was a signal that perhaps even at 36,000 feet, systems could be confronted. Even on cruise control, a course could be changed. As the cabin quieted again, Sienna finally closed her eyes. Sleep did not come quickly, but peace, in some small measure, did. The seatbelt sign had blinked off, but no one truly relaxed. The air in the cabin felt charged now, like static before a summer storm. Most passengers remained quiet. their conversation stilled not by turbulence but by something less visible and far more powerful: awareness and discomfort. Sienna sat still in seat 2A, a paper napkin folded neatly in her lap. Her glass of water was untouched. She had been staring out the window for nearly 20 minutes, though the view offered nothing but ink-black sky and the occasional flicker of distant lightning. Her thoughts were not on altitude, but on history, personal and collective. She was remembering her mother. When Sienna was 8, she and her mother had tried to open a bank account together. It was a big day. Her mom had saved every extra dollar from cleaning office buildings at night, and the goal was to teach Sienna about dignity, about building. But the teller, a white man in his 50s, had looked at the envelope of cash and sneered. "You people should be more grateful for the jobs you have," he said under his breath, not knowing Sienna could hear every word. Her mother had turned, smiled politely, and walked out. That afternoon, she took Sienna to another bank and opened the account in silence. She never spoke about the incident again. But something in her had changed. A small light dimmed, not extinguished, but protected behind thicker glass. Sienna carried that light now, and tonight it flickered. She closed her eyes and let the memory pass like waves. She did not want to drown in it, only to acknowledge it. A voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Russell again, his tone cautious. "Sienna, I know I've said this already, but that was one of the calmest and most commanding things I've ever seen." She opened her eyes, met his gaze without defensiveness. "I didn't do anything special," she said softly. "You did everything," he replied. "You didn't yell, you didn't retaliate, and somehow that made it more powerful." Sienna shook her head gently. Sometimes silence is armor, sometimes it's surrender. The line between the two is thin. Russell hesitated before asking, and tonight Sienna looked toward the aisle where Diana had stood earlier, where Melissa had once barked instructions like she owned the plane. Tonight it was neither, she said. It was strategy. He leaned back, thoughtful. But does it ever get heavy, being the one who has to hold everything together just to make everyone else feel safe? Sienna didn't answer right away. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook, the kind without lines. Inside were pages filled with scribbles, sketches, notes to self, not company memos, not strategy briefs, just fragments of thought, unspoken grief, private observations. She flipped to a page where she'd written just one sentence. "I'm tired of translating my humanity into something palatable." She closed the notebook slowly. "Yes," she whispered. Russell didn't press. Back in row 12, Elijah was still writing. He wasn't sure what this document would become. An op-ed, a legal analysis, maybe something else entirely. But he had the sense that moments like these weren't meant to evaporate. They had to be shaped, preserved, leveraged. That was the only way anything ever changed. Ava passed by with the water cart and paused. "Mr. Dorsey," she said gently, "could I speak with you a moment?" He blinked. "Of course." She nodded toward the galley in the back. He followed. Inside, she handed him a small folder. "I don't know who else to give this to," she said. He opened it. It was Melissa's incident report. Typed, signed, time-stamped, filed just before boarding. The contents were shocking. She had described Sienna as combative, threatening, and unstable, claimed she had been belligerent, refused instructions, and had to be warned twice. It was pure fabrication, Ava said. She filed that before the flight even began. I didn't see it until now. It was preemptive, like she planned for things to go wrong. Elijah stared at the paper, his jaw tightening. And now it's been pulled from record, but not deleted. Corporate will review. He closed the folder carefully. I'll make sure someone sees this, he said. Someone who can actually do something? Ava nodded, her face pale. I just didn't know who else would believe me. He looked at her with unexpected warmth. I believe you. And more importantly, I see you trying. When he returned to his seat, the man beside him, Martin, glanced at the folder. What's that evidence? Elijah said quietly. Of what intent? Martin frowned. You think she planned it? Elijah didn't flinch. I think some people mistake power for permission. In the cockpit, the captain had begun the early descent checklist. They were still 2 hours from landing, but protocol demanded preparation. When the captain received the final report from corporate confirming Melissa's permanent removal from flight duty, he sighed. It was not joy he felt, nor vindication. It was relief, a symptom of too many years witnessing injustice and never knowing whether there would be consequences. He turned on the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, as we begin our slow descent, we thank you again for your patience. We'd like to acknowledge that earlier disruptions have been addressed and will be followed up with appropriate review and accountability. It was a neutral statement, but in seat 2A, Sienna heard the weight behind the words. The crew had received its course correction. Now it was the passenger's turn. Russell reached into his carry-on and handed her a book. She raised an eyebrow. He shrugged. It's not much, but it's called Rest is Resistance. I figured, maybe you need permission too. She smiled, then whispered, I didn't ask for it. I know, but I'm giving it anyway. Somewhere over the Rockies, a single flight glided through night, and within its cabin, a quiet reckoning unfolded. No applause, no fanfare, but dignity had taken root, and this time it refused to be uprooted. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft moved into its cruising altitude again. There was no turbulence outside, but inside the hearts of several passengers there was still a quiet rumble of unrest. Sienna sat perfectly still in 2A, her fingers lightly grazing the worn edges of her leather-bound notebook. She wasn't writing now, she was remembering, processing, breathing. The moments that had just unfolded felt heavier now in retrospect, and she allowed herself to sit with the weight of it. Across the aisle, Russell had taken out his headphones, but he wasn't playing any music. He just watched the clouds from the window seat, chewing the inside of his cheek, restless. He wanted to ask more questions, but he respected silence, especially the kind that someone like Sienna wrapped herself in. The silence that wasn't for show, but for protection. She had said so little, and yet he felt like he had read entire chapters of her life in her eyes. 2 rows behind, the whispering had picked up again. Not loud, not obvious, but that specific kind of murmuring that travels with discomfort. One woman in a navy pantsuit leaned over to her companion and muttered, I don't think that was the right way to handle things. They just humiliated that flight attendant in front of everyone. Her companion, a man with a salt and pepper beard, raised his brow. She humiliated herself. He replied, but she was doing her job. She insisted. He turned to face her fully. Since when does doing your job involve denying someone their seat based on how they look? The woman grew quiet. "Exactly," he said, and turned back to his drink. Tension didn't always need shouting. Sometimes it slid between people like a thin layer of ice, cracking silently beneath their feet. Elijah Dorsey, still in 12C, was reviewing Melissa's fabricated report again. Every word made his stomach turn. The precision of her language, the way she tried to make Sienna seem irrational, even dangerous. It wasn't just a lie. It was a strategic attempt to discredit a black woman who had done nothing but ask for what was rightfully hers. He glanced toward the front. Sienna's back was still, her posture tall, but he could sense the coil of emotion beneath. He reached into his bag and pulled out a pen. At the top of the document, he wrote one line. She used policy like a weapon and assumed the system would load it for her. He paused. Then he wrote another line, but this time it misfired. Sienna turned slightly toward the aisle just as Ava approached again. The young flight attendant held a tray of coffee and tea, but her hand trembled ever so slightly. "Would you like something to drink?" Ma'am Ava asked. Sienna looked at her for a moment. Really looked? Ava was young. Couldn't have been more than 26. The weight of the evening had clearly left its mark in the shadows beneath her eyes and the stiffness of her shoulders. "I'm fine. Thank you," Sienna said gently. "But how are you?" The question took Ava by surprise. Her hand lowered the tray to steady it. I'm all right. I just didn't expect any of this." "No one did," Sienna said. "But you acted. That matters." Ava nodded slowly. "I couldn't stay silent." "Good," Sienna replied. "Don't start." Ava exhaled as if she had been holding her breath for hours. "Thank you," she whispered. When Ava left, Sienna leaned back and closed her eyes again. For a moment, she was 8 years old again. Her mother was holding her hand in a cold lobby. A security guard had been watching them too closely, and her mother had pulled Sienna close and whispered, "We don't flinch. We stand tall, even when they want us to disappear." Sienna had learned the lesson well, but sometimes standing tall came with bruises no one could see. She was tired, not from the confrontation, but from the pattern that seemed to repeat in every boardroom, every airport lounge, every upscale restaurant where she was asked if she was lost or assumed to be the assistant instead of the founder. She had worked twice as hard for half the credit, had smiled through twice the skepticism and been asked to explain her resume as if it were fiction. And still, here she was, in 2A. And they still wanted her to explain herself. Not this time. A small commotion drew her attention. A teenage boy in row 9 had dropped his phone and it had slid several feet forward. The boy jumped up and lunged toward it just as another passenger bent to grab it, nearly bumping heads. The boy mumbled an apology, clearly embarrassed, then returned to his seat. His mother, seated beside him, gave him a soft nudge. "You all right, yeah?" he said, cheeks flushed, "just clumsy." Elijah, watching from behind, smiled to himself. The world kept spinning, even on a plane full of judgment and reckoning. Teenagers still dropped their phones and mothers still offered quiet support. That was something. Then the captain's voice crackled through the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our final descent in approximately 75 minutes. We thank you for your cooperation throughout the flight. Any outstanding concerns may be addressed once we land. In the meantime, please remain seated as we begin light cabin service." Russell turned to Sienna. "Do you think they'll really do anything about her?" Sienna looked out the window again. That depends. On what? On whether they're protecting the airline or the people inside it. He frowned. You think they'll try to sweep this under the rug? They always try, she said. The difference now is whether someone flips the rug over. Russell sat quietly, processing that. Then he asked something unexpected. Do you ever wish you could just be anonymous? Just one of the passengers, not the headline. Sienna turned to him, and for the first time, her smile was wide and full of sadness. I used to, but I've learned that anonymity is a privilege too, one that not all of us get to keep. He nodded slowly. They sat in silence after that. Two people who had started the journey as strangers, now connected by something more powerful than shared space, truth, and the burden of carrying it. The plane hummed gently beneath them, a quiet vibration running through the floor and into Sienna's shoes. The lights had dimmed again, the sky outside transitioning from a clear blue to soft lavender. Altitude had a strange way of distorting time, making each minute feel suspended in the hush between clouds. Sienna sat still, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her fingers curled in a way that might have seemed calm to anyone looking, but inside, she was unraveling thread by thread, not with fear, not with rage, but with exhaustion that had no name. The window beside her reflected her face faintly. She studied her own eyes in the glass, eyes that had once carried fire, ambition, fury, and hope. Now they looked tired, not broken, just weary. She had fought 1,000 small wars that no one documented. Some were in conference rooms, where her voice was either overlooked or stolen. Others were in job interviews where her resume impressed until she walked through the door. A few were in high-end boutiques, where security guards trailed her steps like she was one missed blink away from a theft. And now, at 39, a CEO, an investor, a mentor, and a woman responsible for over 100 employees' livelihoods. She still had to fight to sit in the seat she paid for. There was a quiet injustice in that, a whispering, persistent erosion of dignity. Russell broke the silence beside her. His voice was soft, careful. You know, I once read somewhere that grace under pressure is the highest form of strength. Sienna blinked, still looking at her reflection. You think I was graceful? She asked. He nodded, fiercely. Yeah. You didn't yell. You didn't argue. But you didn't shrink, either. That matters more than you think. Sienna finally turned to look at him. The corners of her lips lifted in a tired but sincere smile. Thank you. She meant it, not because she needed validation, but because sometimes being seen clearly, even for a moment, felt like being given back a piece of yourself. Behind them. In row 12, Elijah Dorsey tapped away on his tablet. He was no longer just documenting the incident. He was drafting a formal inquiry to be submitted to the airline's Board of Ethics. It wouldn't be the first time he'd filed something like this, but it might be the first time it was accompanied by witness statements from a half-dozen first-class passengers and a captain's own in-flight log. He glanced up and looked toward Sienna. She didn't know what he was doing. She didn't need to. His work wasn't about public gratitude. It was about structural correction, fixing the rot beneath polite smiles and polished service. He zoomed in on the part of Melissa Kramer's report that had claimed Sienna became confrontational and uncooperative. He stared at the words like they were poison. They always used the same script. When black women insisted on fairness, they were angry. When they asked questions, they were combative. When they raised a brow, they were threatening. It was coded, conditioned, institutional, and it needed to stop. Sienna closed her eyes again, this time not to reflect, but to rest, for just a second. But her mind did not quiet. She remembered a conversation with her godmother from years ago, back when she was still a middle manager trying to prove she deserved a seat at the table. Her godmother had said, "Baby girl, they'll invite you to the room, but not the conversation. When you speak, they'll call it passion. When they speak, it's called leadership." Sienna had laughed back then, thinking it was just bitter wisdom, but now she knew it was truth, hard-earned and razor-sharp. A sudden knock at her seat back pulled her from the spiral. It was the teenager from row 9. He looked terrified. Miss, I'm really sorry to bother you, but I just wanted to say thank you." She blinked. "Thank you. For what? For standing up? My mom? She gets treated like that sometimes, and she never says anything. I think I needed to see someone push back." Sienna's throat tightened. "What's your name?" she asked. "Jason. Thank you. Jason." He nodded, quickly retreating to his seat, cheeks red, but something about his stride had changed. Slightly taller, slightly more sure. Russell grinned. "That's 2 people you've changed today." Sienna didn't answer. She couldn't. Her chest was too tight with emotion. Sometimes you don't realize you're a mirror until someone looks into you and sees themselves standing straighter. At the front of the cabin, Ava passed Captain Halperin the sealed envelope. He looked down at it, his brows knitting slightly. "This was in Melissa's locker. I thought you should see it." He opened the envelope and found a printed email. It was from a senior operations director, and it outlined a quiet, internal policy about profiling behavioral risk based on attire and appearance. It was thinly veiled, but the language was there. Dress code aligned with first-class norms, attitude markers, uncooperative body language, subtle cues, weaponized in the wrong hands. His jaw tightened. He folded the paper and placed it in his jacket, and then he picked up the phone. Sienna, a few rows back, had no idea. She just stared ahead, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the clouds in a way that almost made the sky look forgiving. Her phone buzzed in her lap. A text from her assistant. "Saw the tweets? It's already going viral. Do you want me to make a statement?" Sienna stared at the message for a long time before typing back. No. Let the silence speak for itself. Then she paused and added, "But archive every comment, every photo, every name." Her finger hovered over send for a second, and then she pressed it. A quiet clarity washed over her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the ones watching, the ones hiding, the ones too tired to speak, the ones who needed to know they weren't alone. From this altitude, the sky seemed endless, but so did the work ahead, and still she flew forward. The flight was now cruising at 39,000 feet, the seatbelt sign off, and the hum of the engines steady like a metronome beneath a symphony of hushed conversation and shifting bodies. But something in the air had changed. Not turbulence, not noise, tension, a slow current running through the cabin like a low-voltage wire, crackling with unsaid things. Sienna looked out the window, her eyes tracing the clouds like brushstrokes on a lavender canvas. Her mind should have been calm, but instead it moved in slow revolutions, looping over the same thoughts with sharp edges. She should have let it go. That's what her old mentor would have told her. Quiet success is the loudest revenge, he used to say. But those words always came from someone who didn't know what it meant to be mistaken for out of place every time she entered a space she'd already earned her way into. She pulled out her notebook, not a tablet, not her phone, a real notebook, leather-bound, worn at the edges, pages filled with blue ink and bent corners. On the front page was a list. People I owe the truth, the title she had scribbled on a red-eye flight 5 years ago. Her niece's name was at the top. Taylor, 17 now, fierce, brilliant, too used to code switching at school. Her godson, Marcus, 9 years old, already asking why he doesn't see more people like his aunt on the covers of the business magazines. She owed them a world better than the one she inherited. She flipped a few pages forward. There it was, a manifesto she'd written at 2 a.m. on a long haul to Berlin. If my silence becomes comfortable, I've chosen the wrong seat, and tonight she hadn't chosen silence, not when Melissa Kramer had tried to reroute her to row 37, not when she was stared down, second-guessed, and offered a refund instead of a seat. Her stomach clenched again, not from fear, but from something deeper, the burden of constantly having to be the bigger person in the face of smallness. Across the aisle, Russell was watching her quietly. He didn't interrupt her reflection, but he noticed the way her hand shook slightly as she turned another page, and it made him ache in a way he hadn't expected. Back in row 12, Elijah Dorsey had connected to the in-flight Wi-Fi. The email to his network of civil rights attorneys had already gone out. He'd titled it, "Incident on Flight 3021. Immediate eyes needed." Attached were a draft statement, Melissa's quote, a timeline from gate to cabin, and a call for passengers willing to sign a shared letter of witness. He wasn't trying to go viral. That wasn't the aim. The aim was pattern disruption, accountability, and systems designed to forget. And right now, he was watching a system respond to exposure with silence. That, he knew, was the most dangerous stage. Not outrage, but stillness, because stillness meant strategy. He looked up just as Ava Chen quietly returned from the galley and slipped into the jump seat, her fingers tightening over the strap. Her face had changed since the confrontation. She no longer looked hesitant. She looked resolute. The captain had sent word that a federal inquiry would be initiated before landing. Elijah suspected Ava would be asked to give her full testimony, and she would. Ava had joined the airline because she loved people. She remembered the first time she saw the clouds from above. She was 14, flying from Taipei to Vancouver, watching her grandmother sleep beside her. That moment, how the sky looked like a blanket stitched by God, had stayed with her, and she'd promised herself she would never let power twist kindness out of her. That promise was about to be tested. Meanwhile, Sienna closed her notebook, her breath steady now, but her thoughts spinning in new directions. Would her board find out? Probably. Would this make her controversial? Likely. Would it matter? Maybe. But then again, how many men had built careers on scandal and still been labeled resilient? Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was not her assistant. It was her younger brother, Ryan. Just saw the footage. Damn, sis, you good? She smiled despite herself. Ryan never used many words, but he always showed up when it counted. She typed back, "I'm okay. Just tired of fighting for the basics." His reply came back in seconds. Then stop fighting for basics. Start making rules. She read it 3 times. Start making rules. It struck something in her. What if this wasn't just another moment to endure? What if it was a pivot? Her phone buzzed again. This time, a tag on social media. A passenger in row 3 had posted a clip. Just 7 seconds. No yelling. Just Sienna saying, calmly and clearly, "I paid for this seat. I belong here." The caption, "Black excellence doesn't beg." It affirms, tens of thousands of shares, thousands of comments, and among them, a quiet, rising question. How often does this happen? It was no longer just about her. It was about all the unseen refusals, the polite dismissals, the micro-denials stitched into the fabric of luxury. Another notification came through. A national journalist had sent a direct message requesting comment. Sienna didn't reply. Not yet. She looked up. Ava was walking toward her with a folded paper in hand. Sienna raised an eyebrow. Ava nodded, a silent invitation to read. It was Melissa Kramer's voluntary resignation form, time-stamped and signed in ink. Sienna didn't speak, but her shoulders dropped an inch. Then Ava leaned in and whispered something no one else could hear. "I'm sorry it took me too long to stand up, but I'm standing now." Sienna nodded slowly. That's all anyone can ask. The plane was silent again, but not empty. In that stillness, a shift had happened, a recalibration of power, and the sky had heard every word, somewhere over the Great Plains, with stars veiled behind wisps of high-altitude cloud. Flight 3021 continued its path westward. Inside, the cabin had quieted, but inside Sienna Jameson, something had stirred wide awake. She reclined her seat slightly and folded her arms, not in fatigue, but in reflection. Her body rested, her mind walked. For the last 40 minutes, she hadn't spoken a word. She didn't need to. Her silence was now the loudest voice on the plane. People had seen, heard. The world outside was already humming with reactions. But Sienna wasn't thinking about the trending hashtags or the news anchor voice that would inevitably try to flatten the story into a soundbite. She was thinking about her father, Harold Jameson, a quiet man who wore suits to grocery stores not because he wanted attention, but because his own father never had the chance to wear one outside a church. He'd taught her 3 things. Always write your own name on your work. Never explain your worth to those who question it for sport. And silence when timed right can sound like thunder. Sienna looked out the window and remembered the only time she ever saw him cry. She was 16, preparing for a state math competition. The final round. She'd been disqualified for suspicious performance. The implication was clear. That night, he sat on the porch, holding the letter and shaking hands, saying nothing for an hour. Then he whispered, "One day, they'll build systems that carry your name and still try to pretend you don't belong in them." Tonight, those words returned, because the aircraft she was on, the model, the design, the cabin flow bore the influence of her company's AI-powered optimization systems. Her firm, Indigo Core, had helped design this exact Boeing 787's seating configuration for fuel economy and passenger comfort. She had a patent, her name on it, stored somewhere inside the navigation firmware, and yet the woman overseeing boarding couldn't imagine her in seat 2A. It was poetic. It was exhausting. She exhaled. Ava Chen returned, this time with 2 beverages in hand, her way of breaking the ice. She handed one to Sienna and, after asking silently, sat in the open seat beside her. They didn't speak immediately. There was no rush. Ava finally said, "I thought being quiet kept things fair, but tonight I saw that silence serves the wrong people. Sienna nodded. Sometimes silence is complicity dressed in patience. Ava swallowed hard. What comes next? Sienna looked at her. That depends. Are you asking what I'll do or what you can do? Ava blinked. Both. There was no bitterness in Sienna's voice, only clarity. Tell the truth when they ask you. Not just about tonight, but about how often this happens in small, unrecorded ways. Ava nodded. I will. And when the company tries to spin it, Sienna added, remember that spin only works when no one holds the center. Ava almost smiled at that. Back in coach. Elijah Dorsey was deep in conversation with two passengers who had quietly moved forward to support the inquiry. One had filmed the early interaction. The other had heard the gate agent mutter, "Not another situation." Before Sienna boarded, Elijah knew how powerful those fragments could be, pieces of a puzzle the airline would otherwise try to scatter. He sent a message to his legal coordinator, secure footage, back up Wi-Fi logs, verify passenger testimonies before arrival, quietly. He looked up. Sienna caught his eye and offered a small nod of respect. It was mutual. They both knew change never came from one voice. It came from choirs of quiet resistance. Russell Blaine leaned toward Sienna a little. I don't want to interrupt this moment, he said gently, but I have to ask. Why didn't you take legal action right there at the gate? Sienna tilted her head. Thoughtful, because the most powerful leverage isn't always a courtroom. Sometimes it's the court of memory. What people remember, what they retell. She sipped her drink. Tonight, I needed people to witness before I needed them to react. Russell considered that. You're changing how I think about confrontation. I'm not interested in confrontation, she said. I'm interested in calibration, resetting how people see value, see presence. She looked at the back of the seat in front of her. They've built systems that reward charisma over character, optics over ethics. That has to change. Russell leaned back, murmuring, You'd make a terrifying politician. Sienna's lips curved faintly. I'd make a devastating strategist. They both chuckled softly, a moment of shared breath before the next storm. Just then, the intercom came on. It was the captain. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are making a scheduled approach into San Francisco. Current arrival time is on schedule. We'd also like to thank you for your cooperation during a unique evening aboard Flight 3021. A pause. I'd like to personally acknowledge that leadership is sometimes shown not from the cockpit, but in the cabin. That was all he said. But it was enough. Gasps were audible. The cabin murmured. And somewhere, someone whispered, That's about her. Sienna remained still. She didn't acknowledge it outwardly, but inside, something lifted. Not victory, not vindication, just a breath of air she'd earned long ago. As the plane descended, the city lights spilled across the sky like diamonds scattered across black silk. Sienna didn't watch them this time. She closed her eyes. Her last thought before landing was simple. If they can't see your name on the wing, make sure they hear your voice in the flight. The wheels touched down with a gentle hum, but the tension remained suspended in the air. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate at San Francisco International, the passengers of Flight 3021 carried with them more than luggage. They carried a story. In first class, Sienna Jameson sat upright, already anticipating the shift. The transition between being on the plane and stepping into the world beyond was often the most dangerous moment for truth. People revised memories. Airlines rewrote timelines. Stories got softened to make apologies easier to digest, but not this time. The moment the seatbelt sign dinged off, Elijah Dorsey was on his feet, not in a rush, but with purpose. He turned to Ava Chen, who was helping an elderly man retrieve his cane from the overhead bin. "Miss Chen," he said quietly, "you've already done the hard thing. When the press asks, you don't need to perform. Just speak from the stillness you showed tonight." Ava blinked. It wasn't flattery. It was a reminder. She nodded. "I will." Passengers began to disembark, but none were in a hurry. Something unspoken passed between them. They weren't just leaving a plane. They were exiting a moment, a shared reckoning. Russell Blaine waited beside Sienna, offering to carry her bag. She smiled and shook her head. "I've carried heavier." He chuckled. "I don't doubt it." When she stepped into the jet bridge, two people were already waiting for her. One was a young black woman with a press badge tucked into her blazer. The other, a middle-aged man in an airline uniform, his expression unreadable. "Miss Jameson," the woman began, "I'm Jasmine Rowe from Bayline News. May I ask later?" Elijah interrupted gently. "She'll speak after she breathes." The uniformed man stepped forward. "Ms. Jameson, I'm Deputy Director Laramie from Horizon Air. We're conducting a full internal review. The employee in question has been suspended, and a team will be reaching out for your account of the events." Sienna's eyes remained calm. "You mean the flight attendant who was escorted off midair, or the gate agent who disappeared before takeoff?" Laramie hesitated. "Both." A beat passed. "Then make sure your review includes the gate footage," she said, voice even, "and your HR complaint backlog." He nodded slowly. "Of course." She walked past them. What none of them realized was that a crowd had started to form near the arrival gate. A mix of travelers, press, and airport employees who had heard something went wrong, but hadn't expected the center of the storm to walk through quietly in a navy trench coat and low heels. No security entourage, no entourage at all. One woman clapped, soft, once, then a second. By the time Sienna reached the terminal's wide glass doors, she was walking through applause. Not thunderous, not choreographed, just raw acknowledgement. The kind that needed no microphone. Inside the parking structure, Elijah opened the passenger door to a black sedan. "Where to?" he asked. "Hotel Valencia," she said. "My room has a view of the Bay Bridge. I want to see something built that didn't try to keep anyone out." He smiled and closed the door behind her. The ride was silent, peaceful, almost, until Sienna broke it. "Elijah," she murmured, staring out the window, "do you ever feel like being the one who speaks up just paints a bigger target?" He didn't answer right away. "Yes," he said, "every day. And does it ever go away?" "No," he said, "but it stops mattering." That was the difference. Not the absence of fear, but the death of permission it once demanded. At the hotel, Sienna stepped into her suite and closed the door. She didn't turn on the lights, just walked to the window, her reflection hovering faintly in the glass. She took out her phone. Notifications swarmed her screen. Mentions, articles, a trending video of the mid-flight removal, reactions, commentary, outrage, praise, debate. None of it moved her as much as the final text from her father's old number. It was a timed message, set to arrive on the anniversary of his death. She had forgotten. The message read, "Whatever room they try to keep you out of. Remember, your fingerprints helped build it." She sank into the nearest chair, closed her eyes. In that moment, memory overtook her, not of the confrontation, but of the hours before it. She'd arrived at the gate early, checked in at the kiosk, smiled politely, wore the same calm tone she always did. The same tone she'd perfected not to appear difficult, not to be perceived as too much. And still, the gate agent's glance had flicked over her like she was a malfunction. And still, the question had come, "Are you sure you're in the right line?" That question, so casual, so sharp, as if belonging had a uniform. She opened her eyes, looked again at the skyline outside. Then she whispered aloud to no one. "Let them question the system. I don't have to question myself anymore." Meanwhile, inside a small office, inside Horizon Air's West Terminal Operations Center, a meeting was being held. The footage had been reviewed, audio enhanced. The gate agent's voice was clearly recorded saying, "We can't risk another PR nightmare like last time." "Just move her," another voice asked. "But she's cleared for 2A. A response. So switch her out before she makes a scene." The room fell silent. Two legal advisors looked at each other, then at the head of ethics compliance. "This is worse than we thought," one whispered. A voice from the corner. "This isn't the first time." At that moment, an executive decision was made. Quietly, but not invisibly. A formal apology would be issued, the employee contracts reviewed, and the following morning, a press release would hit every major outlet. Horizon Air deeply apologizes to Ms. Sienna Jameson and reaffirms our zero-tolerance policy toward discrimination in any form. Effective immediately. We are initiating a company-wide audit of our customer service practices and racial equity compliance, supervised by an independent review board. But it wouldn't be the press release that made headlines. It would be the photograph of Sienna, walking off Flight 3021, back straight, face steady, no drama, no anger, just clarity. The caption read, "Her name isn't just on the boarding pass, it's on the blueprint." The next morning began not with an alarm, but with the distant sound of foghorns rising from the bay. Sienna Jameson stirred, her body still, but her mind already alert. She lay in bed, watching soft daylight filter through the linen curtains. Her suite overlooked the San Francisco Bay, but even the gentle lapping of the water couldn't erase the reality that today would be different. Her phone buzzed. A message from Elijah, "Turn on Channel 6 and breathe." She sat up, remote in hand, flipping on the TV. The screen came to life mid-broadcast. Aerial footage showed the exterior of Horizon Air's corporate headquarters. Reporters gathered like storm clouds at the steps. The anchor's voice was steady. Following the explosive mid-air incident on Flight 3021 Horizon Air, has announced the indefinite suspension of 2 employees and a sweeping review of racial equity policies. But what is the nation talking is not the airline's response. It's the grace and silence of the woman at the center. The footage cut to a still image. Sienna, standing on the jet bridge, looking straight ahead, no sunglasses, no shield. The caption below read, "She didn't yell, she didn't scream, she simply didn't move." The segment continued, featuring interviews from passengers, experts, and legal analysts. Most were supportive, some were skeptical. Then came the panelist's question that stopped Sienna cold. If she weren't a CEO, would we still be talking about this? The others grew quiet. That question hung in the air like a verdict yet to be delivered. Sienna turned off the screen. She sat still for a moment, letting the silence settle around her. She thought of her mother, who'd worked 2 nursing shifts to pay off the rusted Buick that drove Sienna to her first internship. She thought of her father, who used to iron her interview clothes until his hands began to shake. And she thought of herself, not the CEO, but the girl in the corner of the honors classroom, too scared to raise her hand. None of those versions of her were less worthy of justice. The difference was visibility, and now, visibility had found her. She got dressed in a slate gray suit, understated but powerful. No earrings, no makeup, just presence. When she arrived at the press conference later that morning, the energy outside was already pulsing. Elijah met her at the hotel entrance. "You sure you want to do this live? I have to," she said. "For every woman who can't." Inside the hall, dozens of cameras had already been set up. She wasn't the only one giving a statement. Horizon Air's board chair, an independent auditor, and their newly hired director of inclusion were all scheduled to speak, but it was clear who the public had come to hear. When Sienna took the podium, she didn't shuffle papers, she didn't clear her throat. She looked into the lights and imagined the faces of all the women who had whispered "me too" in bathrooms, in Ubers, in HR offices, in silence. She began slowly. "I was denied entry to the seat I'd paid for not because my boarding pass was invalid, but because someone else decided I didn't look like I belonged there." The room quieted. I was not loud. I was not late. I was not dressed unprofessionally. I was not demanding. But even if I had been, none of that would have justified what happened. She paused, letting the weight land. This isn't just about me. This is about pattern. A pattern where women of color are expected to endure indignity quietly, where our calm is interpreted as compliance and our protest as aggression. Camera shutters clicked in the silence. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for reform. I have accepted Horizon's apology. But an apology without transformation is only delay. She looked over at the Horizon executives sitting nearby. Most shifted uncomfortably. "I urge every corporation to audit your silence, not just your staff, but your systems. Racism doesn't wear a name tag. It hides in protocols and standard practices and unchecked assumptions." Her voice softened. "I didn't ask to become a symbol, but if that's what this moment demands, I'll carry it. Not because I enjoy the spotlight, but because too many are forced to live in the shadows." She stepped back. The applause was not thunderous. It was thoughtful, deliberate, the kind that rises when people recognize something true. After the press conference, Sienna found herself in a small green room backstage. She leaned against the wall, her breath finally catching up with her. Elijah joined her, holding 2 cups of tea. "Hot ginger," he said, "for courage." She accepted the cup with a tired smile. "I thought that's what bourbon was for." They laughed. Then came the knock. It wasn't a journalist. It wasn't a VIP. It was a young flight attendant in uniform. "Ms. Jameson," the woman said softly. "My name's Camille. I just wanted to say thank you. I've seen things I couldn't speak on, but you did. You did." Her voice cracked. Sienna reached out and took her hand. "You're the reason I did." That night, news outlets exploded. The speech went viral. Hashtags spread across platforms. She belonged there. Boarding pass not permission. Dignity. At 35K. But more than that, phone lines lit up. Airline HR departments fielded hundreds of calls from employees recounting similar incidents often ignored or buried. and in small, unseen corners of America, people sat up a little straighter. In Chicago, a young black girl named Maya printed out a photo of Sienna and taped it to her locker. In Atlanta, an elderly grandmother sent a check to Indigo Corps. No note, just the words, "For the work you haven't yet done." And in Oakland, in a family kitchen that smelled of lavender and lemon, Ava Chen sat with her mother, trying to explain the moment she chose not to look away. Her mother listened quietly, then said something in Mandarin that Ava hadn't heard in years. It takes a certain kind of strength to see wrong and still stand straight. Meanwhile, Sienna stood at her hotel window again. This time, there were no notifications, no press, no performance, just the quiet of a woman at peace. She looked out toward the Golden Gate Bridge, its red spine barely visible through the dusk. She whispered to the night, "They closed the gate, but I built the road," and somewhere across the country. Another gate agent looked at a boarding pass with a different lens. The ripple had begun. 6 weeks had passed since the incident aboard Flight 3021. In that time, Sienna Jameson had been asked to speak at 5 conferences, turned down 3 documentary requests, and quietly donated $500,000 to a nonprofit that helped women of color file workplace discrimination claims. She had never been busier, never more visible, but oddly, never more centered. She stood now in the departure lounge of Gate C-12 holding her passport, boarding pass, and a calm that she'd come to earn through fire. "Ms. Jameson," the gate agent said, eyes meeting hers without flinch or flicker. "We're ready to pre-board you now. Thank you again for flying with us." Sienna nodded. "Thank you for the dignity." As she stepped through the gate, she noted the subtle differences since that day. There were now quiet signage updates at every horizon gate. Respect is non-negotiable. Gate agents had undergone new equity training, crew staffing had shifted, and the company's inclusion council now had an open seat offered to her. She declined it. Reform didn't require her leadership, it required their integrity. The new flight attendant uniforms included subtle pins shaped like concentric wings, each one meant to represent listening, accountability, and advocacy. Ava had told her that the pin idea came directly from a conversation with her. One ripple. Sienna stepped into the jet bridge, breathing in the familiar scent of aviation fuel and fabric softener. She entered the first-class cabin with her boarding pass in hand. This time, no one stopped her. No one hesitated. Her seat 1A was already waiting, a cup of water with lemon resting in the holder, her name softly printed on a welcome card. She took her seat slowly, not ceremonially, but intentionally. As the plane began boarding, she glanced out the window. It was cloudy, but steady, much like the world she was stepping back into. Elijah had texted her that morning. "Sometimes we have to sit in turbulence to show others how to land." She smiled at that. A flight attendant approached someone new. "Excuse me, Ms. Jameson, there's a passenger in row 21C who asked to speak with you briefly, only if you're open to it." Sienna considered this. "Who is it?" She said her name is Valerie. The name made Sienna's posture shift slightly. Valerie Logan, the original passenger, the one who had claimed her seat, who had looked through her as if her presence were an inconvenience, an offense. Sienna exhaled. "You can bring her up. Just her." Moments later, Valerie stood before her, older than Sienna remembered, more tired, or maybe just more unguarded. She didn't sit. She stayed standing, her fingers wrapped tightly around the strap of her handbag. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Valerie said. "That's good," Sienna replied calmly, "because I'm not offering it." Valerie nodded. "I watched the press conference and the interviews, and I realized I've been carrying assumptions like luggage, quiet, heavy, and never questioned." Sienna didn't speak. She waited. Valerie's voice softened. "I came up here not to erase what I did, but to make sure you saw my face, not out of guilt, but out of recognition of what I didn't see that day, and what I can't unsee now." Sienna tilted her head slightly, studying her. "Then I'll give you what I would have given you that day room." She motioned to the empty seat across from her. Valerie didn't sit, but she smiled, slightly, almost painfully. "That's more than I deserve," she whispered before turning to walk away. After she left, the cabin resumed its hum. Passengers found their seats. Bags slid into overhead bins. The flight safety video played. Sienna rested her head back as the plane began taxiing down the runway. She thought of her parents again, of all the gates they never reached, of all the moments they were too tired to fight for. She thought of Ava, still working the skies, of Elijah, still fighting courtroom battles no one filmed, of Camille, standing tall now, emboldened not just by policy, but by witness. She thought of Maya, of young girls watching from locker-lined hallways, seeing someone who looked like them and did not flinch. The plane lifted off the ground. There was no applause, no grand orchestra, just gravity surrendering. At cruising altitude, the clouds parted and soft amber light spilled across the cabin. It bathed the seats in a warmth that felt like something earned. The pilot came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are flying at 38,000 feet, just above a thin cloud deck and below a beautiful streak of sunrise. Clear skies ahead." Sienna closed her eyes, the words settling deep. She didn't need the sky to clear. She had already learned how to fly through storms. Her hand reached into her carry-on and pulled out a slim journal. She flipped to the middle pages and began writing. June 12th. Altitude 38,000 on FT. Status seen wounds not erased, but understood purpose unfolding. A flight attendant approached again. "Would you like dinner service now?" Ms. Jameson. Sienna looked up, her expression peaceful. "No, just the tea. Ginger." And with that, she turned back toward the window. Somewhere out there, invisible above the clouds, was the truth of her story, not the headlines, not the outrage, but the quiet revolution born from being willing to stay seated when the world asked her to move. She had built a legacy not through dominance, but through presence. She had answered silence with clarity. And, above all, she had reminded the world that dignity does not require permission. It simply needs to be claimed. The seatbelt light flickered off. But for Sienna Jameson, the light would never dim again. Sienna never raised her voice. She didn't fight with fists, but her presence, her refusal to disappear, that changed everything. The seat wasn't just a seat. It was a symbol for every woman of color told to wait, to move, to prove herself one more time. And this time, the world saw what happens when someone stays, from a denied boarding to a mid-air reckoning. Sienna's story reminds us that dignity doesn't need permission. It needs courage, and that silence in the face of injustice is just as loud as complicity. But beyond the headlines and policies, the story leaves us with one question. How many Siennas are still being told to move? Let's not wait for the next flight to act. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel, because every story we tell here stands for justice, empathy, and the fight against discrimination. See you in the next story. Until then, stay kind, stay loud, and never give up your seat when it's rightfully yours.